My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am your host, and today we have an expert in our field. And so the interesting thing about this is I recently recorded a podcast with Keith Davids, who has spent decades and decades and decades studying skill acquisition, motor learning, the theory, and also the practical side of things, maybe a bit less so. And we had a quick chat on expertise and how that tends to develop over time, what it means to be an expert. But looking at Mel Davis's CV, you would just assume that she's an expert in what she's been studying, given the wide variety of experiential knowledge and then also theoretical knowledge that she's been able to amass. So Mel, hopefully that was an apt introduction. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I hope I can live up to that introduction.
That was somewhat vague. People just understand that you're an expert. You spent a lot of time studying a specific field and researching it, but maybe you can fill in the details. You can tell people like what you actually studied, how long you studied it, what you do for work now, and then we will dig into kind of how you came to that point. But maybe you can go over that stuff.
Totally, yeah. So I got my undergrad degree was in neuroscience, so a little bit more sort of molecular, cellular-based neuroscience. And then my PhD was in neurobiology and behavior, so a little more sort of learning, memory, behavior focused, still pretty molecular and cellular, but with that additional sort of, if you want to call it psychological end of neuroscience. My research my grad research was in stroke. It was in, I'll try to make this not overly complicated, but it was basically somatosensory stimulation, induced recovery from stroke damage in the brain. So sort of plasticity in the brain has always been a big thing in my research. My postdoc research was a little more complex, but pretty fun. We transplanted brain tissue from mouse fetuses into adult mice who were blind and cured their blindness. So basically another instance of studying plasticity and how the brain can change and trying to figure out what factors make the brain capable of change and what make it less capable of change. Throughout all of my research days, I was doing jiu-jitsu competitively. So I always had this sort of very deep side interest in how sport and the brain sort of overlapped. Like, why do I feel this way? How can I better mentally prepare for my competition? How can I, physically prepare? What are the scientific principles I can apply to that? So sort of having those two passions led me to be very interested in how you can apply science to all the things you want to get done.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that sticks out is, taking a tissue from one, if we want to call it like an organism, and injecting it or transplanting it into another. How well was it taken up or integrated?
It was taken up really, really well. So it was mouse to mouse. The mice we were using were a specific genetic breed that made it a little bit easier. But yeah, nothing particularly special. It was just mouse fetal brain tissue moved into adult mouse brain.
Yeah. And again, I guess this would be a huge question, but from all of that time spent studying, basically the brain, the nervous system, the way it functions, the way it adapts, develops, all of that stuff. What are some major takeaways that really stick with you in the sense of, I guess it could be as general or as vague as like how robust humans are, or how robust like the brain is to taking up, whatever it may be, right? Because I don't want to like prime a certain answer or response, but what have you taken away that really sticks with you and guides?
I think that there was an idea for a really long time that the brain was sort of very static and set by the time you were an adult. And I think from all of my research and studies, what I've taken away is that's not at all true. And it might not be easy to induce plasticity in the adult brain on a large scale, but it's possible. And on a small scale, we kind of experience it every day, right? We learn new motor tasks. We learn to do new things. So there is a great deal of malleability still in the brain. So for me, that's inspiring. Like, I'm 40, I can still do stuff. I can still learn stuff. I can still change my habits. So
Yeah, I like that. And I think it goes against that traditional wisdom of, oh, you're in your 30s or your late 30s and your performance has to decline. It's like a death sentence pretty much. Like, because we hear that in the sport of weightlifting a lot. People age out of the senior division into the master's division when they're 35. And that's almost a badge of honor and saying, hey, expect worse performance. You're going to feel worse. You're not going to train as much. It's kind of a strange, like, cultural concept of aging.
There's definitely the physical aspect. There's definitely something there. I think probably more for men than women just because of hormonal changes. But I certainly think, like, the degree that people lower their expectations and stuff is probably unwarranted. You are probably going to have to be a little smarter with your training. You might not make gains as quickly, especially if you've been lifting for a long time. You might recover a little slower, but it doesn't at all mean that you have to stop progressing.
Yeah, and I think when you acknowledge that, there's that kind of inability to improve, I think that just excludes the idea of training age altogether, because someone who started when they're 34 obviously will have different gains through their 30s than someone who started when they were 24 or 14.
Yeah, if you started when you're 35, you're going to make massive jumps.
Which is awesome. And I think we indirectly kind of hopped on a topic we can touch on now before you get into, like, really the meat and potatoes of the topics we wanted to discuss. But you did recently write a book that is, I guess, like, foundationally derived from the concept that people can change, and it's not set in stone. You don't live one life, and that's kind of whatever you were bestowed upon through, like, the developmental period. So what was the inspiration for the book? I think the name's Building Habits, Getting Shit Done. What was the inspiration? And then we could, touch on a lot of the kind of foundational concepts that help people build habits and get shit done.
Yeah. So I think so I did coaching for a long time, and I still do some coaching at Renaissance Periodization. And I just noticed that some of the most impactful things for people actually being successful in their body composition or performance goals was really their ability to change their behavior. It wasn't so much, they had so much motivation or so much willpower. It was really just that they developed really good, strong habits, and then all these things sort of came easy to them. And I started thinking about what I knew about behavior modification based on my, educational background, and thinking, what, I would love to put together, I know there's a lot of books on habits out there, but I would love to put together just a very evidence-based, like, I also want to know, what do we know about that, and what is sort of some of the best tactics for changing our behavior. So I just dove into the literature and started reading everything I could. I avoided reading actually all of the other habit books out there because I wanted to have my own unbiased perspective. And at this point, I'll probably go read those and just see how much we overlap. But yeah, so basically seeing people do really well when they had good habits, and personally wanting to improve my life and continue to, get better and more efficient.
Yeah, and maybe you could go into the differences, and you kind of touched on it earlier, but between like the concepts of motivation, willpower, habit, because I think a lot of speakers and books are directed at improving motivation, and that motivation leading to change. And I could be wrong, right? Motivational speakers, that's like the title. So I think that's kind of like the gestalt of the field. So how does that go wrong? What are people getting wrong when they invest too much in motivation? And what is motivation?
Yeah, so there's no harm in motivation. Motivation is that sort of drive to get something done. There's nothing wrong with trying to facilitate motivation and willpower. Those are both helpful, and to some degree you have to have some motivation and willpower to even dive into behavior modification or habit change. But what you really want to be able to do is rely on something more constant than willpower and motivation. So Motivation, we all kind of know it's always high at the beginning, and when you get into the nitty gritty of the work, it tends to wane a little bit. I think anecdotally, we've all experienced that. Willpower is what a lot of people promote for pushing you through when that motivation sort of fades. But willpower is also an interesting one because it kind of waxes and wanes. There was a lot of research before saying that willpower was this finite research that just sort of could fade away if you used it too much, and that you have to strengthen it and things like that. And I think there's been a lot of debate in the research about it. I think the best description to me of what willpower is that it's akin to an emotion. So it sort of, you don't run out of sadness, you don't run out of joy, you don't run out of willpower. It just is stronger at some times and weaker at others. And so ideally, you have something more reliable to fall back on when willpower happens to wane. And I think just to bring up an interesting study, and this is one of my favorite studies to quote because it really hit me. The researchers took two groups of students. First of all, they surveyed a large group of students, and then they divided them into either sort of habitually healthy eaters or habitually less healthy eaters. So we had one group that had sort of had pretty balanced breakfast, another group that just ate pastries in the morning most of the time, if they ate at all. And then they followed them through the very stressful exam week times, and they found that, as expected, the pastry eaters ate more pastries and skipped breakfast more often during exam week. But the people who had the healthy eating habit actually ate healthy options more often during exam week. So, and there's a lot of other research to back this up. I just think that one's really illustrative. It seems that whether our habits are good or bad, we do them more when we're stressed. And that's a super valuable thing when you're seeking a goal.
So is it kind of that idea of when you develop habits, you rely less on the waxing and waning of willpower?
Absolutely.
Okay, and a couple things that I think about stemming from that. How would someone's, I guess, so you use the example of two different groups who have two different breakfast, strategies. How would some basic function like available energy or like perceived fatigue or tiredness or something like that start to change and mess with the things that aren't as structured like a habit? So willpower and motivation. How would like physiological functions, I guess, change your ability to exert willpower?
They do. They impact it quite a bit, but they do not impact habits very much. And in fact, they make habits more likely. So another study looking at people going to the gym, those who had a habitual gym habit, like they went the same 3 or 4 days a week at the same time, when they got extremely stressed, tired, fatigued, overwhelmed, they continued to go to the gym, whereas people who were motivated to go to the gym but didn't have a sort of set habit yet just dropped off entirely when they were faced with, fatigue and stress and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff. And I think it just kind of highlights the interconnectedness of all of these things. Like people feel like they're a bad person because they can't motivate themselves or exert their willpower, but it could be just something out of their control. So laying down this foundation of, habit is almost something to lean on. And I've noticed that for myself. Because I've lifted weights for, consistently for like 8 years now. And I don't know what it would take to get me to not go to the gym.
Right.
It's actually like, it'd have to be something very extreme. Like a good example is a while back, I actually had surgery for some just like, emergency thing. But that's the only reason why I didn't train.
Yeah.
And during the recovery process, I didn't train. But beyond that kind of circumstance, I would imagine it would take another, getting hit by a car or something really extreme. But so off of that, how do people develop habits, I guess, is a good question to kind of work from.
Yeah, so one super important thing is to just start off really small. So if you are, for instance, and consider also where you're coming from, right? Like if you already go to the gym 4 times a week, switching to 5 or 6 days a week is not a big deal. You have an understanding of the gym, you know where the gym is, you know your routine, you know the equipment, you have all of this baseline important knowledge so that adding a couple days is not a big deal. If you have never been to the gym before, adding even 2 days might be a lot to start. You might want to start with just 1 day, or you might want to start not even going to the gym, but just learning about the gym first, to like looking up lifting videos and reading some books and doing this kind of stuff so that you have a baseline knowledge. So when you start going, the amount of things that have to change, the amount of learning and difference to your life is much smaller, and that makes it easier to sort of stick it on there and keep it as a part of your life.
Yeah, and I think people find comfort in predictability, and anticipating something. So if I were to tell someone that, hey, we're going to do this for 1 week, it's mapped out, it's planned out, so we have something to follow in some sort of structure. I think that's more comfortable than saying like, we really don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
It could change at any moment. So when you're developing habits, is there a way to more effectively go about incorporating them? And is there a timeline we're looking at to where something becomes right, being motivated to, being consistent to being a habit?
The timeline for that is going to differ depending on how big of a change the new desired habit is, and sort of your point in the journey in that kind of arena, if you know what I mean. So like,
yeah,
if you're brand new to fitness, it's going to take a lot longer to have a habitual 4 times a week training habit. If you're not so new, it won't take as long to develop the habit of, a new training plan or whatever that is. And along the lines of what you were saying earlier, sometimes a coach can be really helpful for that, because part of the big change, like you said, is the learning and the anticipation, and not being sure what you're getting into or what's going to happen adds sort of a level of stress and focus that takes a lot of your energy. So if you have someone who's kind of guiding you and helping you and telling you what to expect and explaining things to you, that can take a lot of the pressure of the change off. In terms of going from something not being a habit to it being a habit, it sort of depends on what the habit is. So if it is something like, I am trying to speak more loudly because I've been shy my whole life and I speak really quietly, then that's one of those things you would want to develop slowly. So you pick the easiest point. Like, where's the easiest place for me to speak loudly? Maybe with my family on the weekends, I can speak up a little louder. And then maybe it's a little more tough with my friends, but that'll be my next step. And then the next step will be when I'm interacting with strangers, and you sort of ease yourself in from the easiest to the hardest context. And importantly, practicing it in lots of different contexts, because the more situations you practice the habit in, the more it sort of paves this nice road in your brain that will make that behavior more automatic. It's a little more complicated with something like the gym, right? Because the gym is the context and the gym is the thing you're trying to do. So that might mean that you practice in the context of different moods. Like at first, you only go to the gym when you're feeling great. You didn't have a great day, but you're going to go to the gym anyway. Next step, you had an awful day, you go to the gym anyway. Next step, you're traveling out of town, working and stressed, and you go to the gym anyway. And you sort of work your way up from the easiest to the hardest place and situation to do your desired behavior. And once you've done that in tons of contexts and repeated it over and over again, chances are it will become habitual.
I didn't think about it in that way. Executing some sort of habit based on, like, I guess, like mood state, because my understanding, and I guess the way a lot of people approach it, is a habit is kind of, it's not necessarily numerical, but it's like really, really kind of objectively defined as I need to go to the gym twice a week or 3 times a week. And there's no, I guess, flexibility built into that. And if you can't execute, it's like, there's some sort of failure there, and that might act as a setback. How do you, I guess, with that in mind, so you want to execute a behavior under different circumstances so that kind of in the future, when you experience any of those circumstances, you're going to execute the behavior. How do you keep someone invested through that process of developing the habit day to day, week to week, month to month, hour to hour, something like that?
Right. So before I jump into that, I would just say another sort of tactic, I'll come back to your question, but another sort of tactic is to make yourself do a part of the habit. So if you're trying to go to the gym and you experience your first day in this, behavior change plan where you really don't feel like going to the gym, maybe you just make yourself drive to the gym, walk in the door, and walk back out. So you sort of you still get the initiation part of the habit, and that'll take you further than if you just stayed home. So you can do just an approximation or the first step. And very often people end up training, once you're already at the gym, you've taken away the hard part. But back to your question, I forgot what it was.
No, I think that's a great point. I think I don't know if people necessarily, again, it's kind of like this black and white situation with habits where you either have some like really extreme objective, like going 3 times a week, or you have failure. And I think seeing everything in between, all of those shades of gray, as I just got my gym clothes on, I prepared myself to go to the gym. It kind of sounds silly, and I'm not laughing, but
No,
it
it
kind of sounds
definitely
silly.
does. It definitely does.
But it does matter in developing some sort of foundational, almost like a system that you can put in place, where you change, you get ready, you grab your stuff, you make your protein shake, and then every time you start to kind of go through that sequence, it becomes more automated.
It becomes kind of a ritual, and one thing leads to the next thing, and once you've started making the shake, you don't have to worry about the rest because it sort of automatically follows. And
Right.
you bring up another good point in terms of black and white. People often think about it like that, like I'm either successful in my plan to go to the gym X days a week or I'm not, when really habit change is a slow, gradual process. It's kind of like, it's akin to saying, I'm going to lose 15 pounds. And then if you don't lose it tomorrow, feeling like you failed, right? So if your plan is to go to the gym several times a week, maybe it's going to take you a couple months to do that consistently. But what you want to look for is getting a little closer to that ideal across those couple months. And then I remembered your question, how to keep people going through this process. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a number of things you can do. First, and this is something that's talked about quite a bit because there's a lot of solid data behind it. You want your reason for doing whatever you're doing to be internally driven, even if you have to reframe it as internally driven. So maybe you're thinking, I want to go to the gym because I want that guy at work to notice me because I'll look fit and great and I have a crush on him, whatever. But perhaps you can reframe that as an internal drive. Like, I would like to be healthy. I value hard work. I feel like a fit body is a demonstration of my values of hard work. And that's why I'm going to the gym. So set yourself a sort of a internal drive that tends to carry people longer than an external drive looking for, social approval or some kind of reward. Sometimes reward plus internal drive can be great. Sometimes it can be detrimental, but internal drive is almost always helpful. So figuring out what your why is. It sounds a little cliche, but figure out what your why is and remind yourself of that when you're feeling like you don't want to continue in the process when it gets difficult.
Yeah. And I know the audience who listens to the podcast I put out is kind of wide and diverse, not super diverse. It's called the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. They either like weightlifting or they like philosophy or both. So it's not super, diverse, but understanding that people are different, right? We get different responses to an exercise program. We get different responses to really any intervention that's aimed at changing a behavior, changing some like function of, the cardiovascular system or something. You see like a very diverse response. So knowing that developing habits is something that's, one, a lot of work, two, takes, what you outlined in the book, kind of the system you outlined. How does it change between individuals? I mean, we talked about like just preparing yourself or getting in the car or going through the doors. Whereas for me, when I started thinking about physical training, it was very simple for me to adopt those behaviors and to start training consistently and going to the gym consistently. I imagine it's not like that for everyone. Now, could you chalk that up partly to other differences in background that aren't specific to the other habit, or is it differences in, I say personality, but other like intrinsic differences? Like, what goes into building habits that would vary between person to person?
Yeah, so definitely different. I think both of those things contribute. So I had a question. I did a Q&A on the RP Instagram a little while ago. And a woman asked, she said, what if I hate everything it takes to reach my goal? And she basically was like, I want to lose weight, but I hate exercise and I hate dieting and I hate health food and stuff. And I was like, well, so it's partly in like, we have genetic predispositions to like enjoy different things or just sort of growing up experience to value different things. But we also, have ways of framing things. And I think that's where we can make changes. So if you reframe it from like, I hate exercising, and look for the one thing you can enjoy. Like, do I enjoy seeing like the numbers on my squat go up every week? Does that make me feel self-efficacious and awesome? Okay, let's put all of our focus on that. Or maybe you really don't enjoy it, but you do have an intrinsic drive and you value fitness, so you're going to do it. So maybe your tactic then is not so much to look for the thing you enjoy, because there really isn't that much of it. Maybe your goal is to make the behavior as easy as possible. Maybe you, on Sundays, you set out all your gym clothes for the whole week and all of your shakes are prepped in the fridge, and you just take away all of the difficult aspects for you so that the behavior can be as easy as possible to do. Or some people might do well if they have a buddy to go to the gym with, and it becomes, a coupling of socializing along with the fitness that drives them to want to go do the fitness things because they get to socialize there. So depending on the person, you might have to find a different way to develop the habit, to motivate the person to develop the habit.
Yeah, and I guess this is wide ranging, right? I say that, picking up fitness or healthy eating for me was simple, but I'm terrible at math, and even saying it like that probably isn't super productive. And I never developed the skills or the habits to become better at math. So, it really is specific to a behavior, not so much specific to I guess to a person. But I guess the last question I would have, kind of around the book in these concepts. How can people navigate this social media space to maximize, I guess, what they can get out of it and minimize? Because if we're talking about what's your why, I think, social media can drastically alter people's whys or being goal-oriented versus process-oriented. So it can act as both a positive and a negative. How can people navigate social media to maximize what they get out of building, healthy and positive habits?
So I think one of the main things is, and a lot of people will just kind of blow social media off as like a net negative, and that there are some negatives. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you're following a bunch of fitness models and a bunch of people who are, Instagram fitness people who are taking pictures of their body and you're comparing yourself to them constantly, that can actually lead to, and this is fun, actually it's opposite fun, it can lead to more motivation to be fit, but less work towards that end. Is an awful place to be because you're more upset, but you're not working towards it as much. So avoiding social comparison, not following as many fitness models, or at least not using their results as your goal and just comparing yourself to yourself is really important. But I think social media can be a really awesome space. It's a space where you can find, a lot of evidence-based people to learn from. You can find accountability buddies. Maybe no one in your life is doing, diet or fitness or body composition change or has weightlifting goals or anything like that. But you can find an online forum where you meet people with similar goals and you can sort of drive your own motivation and your own interest and your own learning by interacting with those people and having support from people who understand what you're doing. So it can be really valuable or it can be really harmful, all depending on how you use it. So basically, avoid comparison and look for support.
And I love the diversity of it. So I just happen to have gotten in this place in Instagram where I follow a lot of people who, took up lifting weights in their, in their mid 40s or 50s or whatever. And then people who are national champion, international medalists, Olympians. And it's cool seeing the same motive and actually talking to the people through the podcast has been really helpful too. One, because you see, I would say genetic disparity where you'll have someone who starts lifting weights, and they squat triple body weight when they're 14, right. And you're like, okay, you can't chalk that up to training history or programming, really.
Yeah.
And then you get people who are, again, Olympians, but the drive is, to be the best version of themselves. So it illustrates the differences in people, and then not only in skill level and expertise, but motivations and drives, how they've done it, the struggles they've faced. Yeah. So I guess it opens up. It tells 1,000 words, whereas a picture might tell one. So it's kind of why I like it too. But
it's definitely dependent on who you follow too, because not everyone on Instagram is going to show you the struggle in between or talk about what they went through. Some people just show you the before and after, which can be intimidating if you don't understand sort of what went on in between.
Right. No, I agree completely. And to finish this segment of the podcast where we cover I haven't read it, so I can't say it's fantastic, but I would, assuming what I know about you, which is very little, but knowing you have some expertise, I'm assuming it's a really good book. And if RP puts it out, they do awesome work. Again, they put out great products. I've read some of their books, and they're all fantastic. So I'm assuming it's not just like a clickbait, quick write ebook. What are the I guess if we were to summarize and to boil this down into 30 seconds or a minute and a half, what's the take on habits that people can kind of pull away from this and either incorporate tomorrow, or after they read your book, use it to reinforce what they get from it?
Yeah. So I would say I have a couple things. First, do not underestimate the importance of setting a realistic goal for yourself. If you're a beginner, start with just learning goals and forget about outcomes. Keep your outcomes super vague. If you are experienced in your goal arena, set a more challenging goal and you will probably be more successful. Another important takeaway is it's going to take time. So don't expect change overnight, and be careful to track and record changes. So, like if you're trying to quit swearing, for example, if you aren't counting how many times you swear per day and you aren't being aware of that, then you might not know you went from 20 words to 17 words across weeks on average. So keep track and monitor yourself and know that it will take time and that it's an individual process, and you might have to try multiple techniques to alter your behavior and figure out which one is the most effective for you in that case, in that instance.
No, that's fantastic. And everyone listening, if you want to pick up this book, you can go to renaissanceperiodization.com and you can find it along with Scientific Principles of Strength Training and all of the other great books that exist, and will pretty much teach you way more than I learned in my undergrad in exercise science. So, it's an excellent resource. Now, Mel, I do want to rewind a bit and go more into your background and why you actually chose the path that you ended up choosing. So you said you studied neuroscience in your when you got your undergraduate degree. What kind of led you down that path of kind of more so specializing in that field?
Yeah, so I guess to go way back, I was always kind of just, biology was always my best subject. And for whatever reason, when I started undergrad, I had this grand idea that I needed to be an English major. And I started as an English major, and that was going great, and I loved it. But then at some point, probably sophomore year-ish, I was like, well, what jobs can I have? And I looked into it, and I was like, this will not do. It was basically like, write books, have a very small chance of success, just starting, on your own like that. I was thinking writing fiction and things like that, or be a professor. And it just seemed so limited to me and kind of boring in the long run. So I was like, you know what, let's revisit this. And I bounced around for a while. I studied Spanish, I studied Japanese. I just tried to figure out what I wanted. And I took a neuroscience class as I can't remember what they call it. They're sort of like you have to take one of these classes, pick one of these 10. And I picked neuroscience and I took it. And I was like, oh my God, this is it. And I had, at the time, no real intention of applying to grad school, but I met a really awesome professor and he sort of took me under his wing. He thought I was good at this stuff and I should do it. And he sort of explained to me how science grad school works, how PhD programs work, and you do research and things like this. And I, had no idea that existed. So I was really excited and I applied for a PhD program. I got in and I loved every minute of it. As I went through my roommate in grad school was good friends with Dr. Michael Israetel. And so he started coming and staying with us every summer, and I got to know him. And, of course, he was getting into exercise science at the time too. And I started sort of chatting with him about that, and I got interested in that. And it was sort of a side thing that I did, like look up papers, ask questions and stuff. After grad school, I went on to my postdoc research, and I realized how much of research is actually not research, and it's writing grants and crossing your fingers that the money for the research will come, and 70-hour work weeks and things like that. I kind of felt like, I don't know if this is how I want to go about science. And I had the opportunity to start working with RP because of Dr. Mike. And I started doing that part-time, and I found that it was super fulfilling to me to be able to help and teach people who actually wanted to learn, whereas the students I was teaching who are undergrads didn't seem like they wanted to learn. They sort of were fighting for points all the time. And like, then I was encountering these people with RP who were like so interested in learning and understanding why. And it was so much more fulfilling to sort of, to help them learn. And, you know, the hours were better. And I finally just switched over completely to RP. I do miss research, but it's been more fulfilling to sort of help people who are so interested in learning.
Yeah, and this is always a tough question, and I think a lot of people opt for a non-answer. But kind of looking back on that kind of span of time when you got into college initially, and then up to this point, is there anything you wish you would have done differently, or changes you wish you would have made sooner that maybe would have gotten you to where you are earlier, or would have led to a more fulfilling outcome, just based on what you know now?
Yeah, you know, sometimes I wish that I had started jujitsu earlier just so that I could have had a longer competitive career. I started when I was, 27 or 28, and I got my black belt in my late 30s. So I kind of crunched my competition days down. But really, every time I think about that, I think about the way that the series of things in my life, the way everything's fallen together and how it's led me. Like I met my husband through Dr. Mike. Maybe if I had been focusing on my jiu-jitsu career earlier, I wouldn't have overlapped with my roommate in grad school or met Mike or any of these things. So, I think I'm pretty good with how it went.
The thing about it too is you've accomplished, one, just getting a black belt. You mentioned kind of the amount of time it's taken or took to do that, and then also to get a PhD. I mean, everyone kind of recognizes the amount of time and effort to do that as well. What do you think it's just something that comes more naturally? And I'm not saying this to discredit it, but something that comes more naturally to you to just work really, really hard at something for a long period of time? Or was it something that you developed kind of incrementally as these challenges came up, you were able to adjust and adapt and then overcome? Or is it, you just have this inclination to kind of work tirelessly towards these ends?
I think I have a little bit of inclination, but I think it also just was a product of my situation. Like my family didn't have a lot of money. I was the first person to go to college. So I worked full time all through undergrad. So I was going to school full time, working full time. And at the time I was also actually training Aikido. And at some point in there, things nearly fell apart several times. But at some point in there, I realized the only way, if I want to do all of these things, the only way to do it is, every time there's a free hour, that's when you have to get whatever the next thing is done. There's no sort of waiting. And I developed kind of a habit of fill the empty space with work and don't take a break until, the work is done. I don't necessarily think that's the right way to go, but I think it helped me manage things later when I decided I wanted to get a certain amount of things done that are difficult to do at the same time.
Yeah, knowing that habits can be, again, wide ranging from just trying to train multiple times a week to getting an advanced degree to getting a black belt. Someone who's on a journey as extensive or as arduous as getting, say, a black belt or a PhD, and not like that they're comparable, but something that's going to take around a decade. Like, what's the advice beyond just developing good habits?
Yeah.
Or is that really what it boils down to?
No, I think there's definitely something else that's important, and that's keeping your focus on your current behavior and the little wins. If you start jujitsu, with a white belt and you're just focused on the black belt, it's so distant and hard to even fathom that could be a reality, that focusing on that is not a great motivator. Whereas if you focus on okay, I'm gonna learn this guard technique, and by the end of this month, I'm gonna have it down so perfect that I'll execute it in rolling. These little tiny goals and wins that can carry you through until you get to that far, far away outcome. So you really have to focus on the little milestones. Otherwise, it's, the distant outcome goal just can't be a reality in your head, and it can't be that motivating.
A quote that kind of sticks with me, Lane Norton was talking about getting his PhD, and he was kind of recounting on how long he kind of felt happy or really satisfied or over the moon about finally getting the degree. And he said that feeling maybe lasted for 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks, and then it was kind of back to normal.
Yeah.
And I think you bring up a really good point, right? I think people more so um, inflate the feeling they'll have or the notoriety or the skills, like maybe not the skill set, but like when they finally get that thing, that egg at the end of the road, that golden egg, it's going to be way more magical than it is. Not that it's not
Yeah.
rewarding, but what I found to be rewarding out of something that takes a long span of time and a lot of work is just the skills you end up with, right?
Right.
The habits, the different areas of expertise or abilities to kind of adapt to different situations. Was that kind of the same feeling for you when you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like that really is the key, because it doesn't matter how big your achievement is, like there's only so long that you're going to be glowing about it. And I think that's the case with a PhD, with a black belt, with just about anything. And I think that if you can, it's sort of about how you frame it again. Like if you can frame it as being proud along the way of the expertise you develop, just kind of like something that got me through, like when I first started my postdoc, it was a new lab. It was a bunch of new techniques and software and imaging machines and things that I hadn't used before, surgeries I hadn't done before. And it was really overwhelming. And I just kind of, the way I pushed through was I got a lot of joy from like, okay, I'm going to learn to do this surgery better than anyone in the lab. I'm going to practice it until it's like flawless and beautiful, and I can be, proud, and people want me to teach them how to do it. And those were the kinds of things I did because there's just so much to learn and it was so overwhelming. So I would get sort of self-efficacy and pride from just relentlessly working on something until I'd mastered it, and then taking joy in that mastery, even if it was just a very tiny thing to master.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting point, and one I bring up from time to time is I remember I like started my run at my education, and the first anatomy class I had, the thing I told myself the first day was, I'm going to do better than everyone in this class.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was my one goal, and how hard or easy that is, I can't really tell you, but
Yeah.
I think I ended up getting the highest grade. That's kind of irrelevant, but the mindset was just like, let's focus on doing the best job we can do, executing and holding, I guess, yourself to a high standard,
Mm-hmm.
and then trying to develop that early on so it kind of continues. But no, I think that's awesome. How do you contrast that with, so you get basically the crowning achievement in two different fields, of martial art and then also in academia. What's next? Like, how do you, is it a matter of finding something bigger than that or more meaningful than that? Or is it, just using those skills to accomplish other smaller, more individual goals?
Yeah, I kind of, at this point, and I like to think it's a product of having gone through those two processes, that I'm looking usually for something that is hard and challenging, because I get so much joy and self-efficacy from challenging myself and, being a little bit afraid and figuring it out and doing it anyway and eventually mastering it. And those hurdles bring me a lot of joy. So definitely always looking for the next thing. I am currently trying to learn. I bought a mule and I'm learning to train equines and hopefully to pack, so that I can, pack out into the backcountry here in Montana with my mule. So that's sort of my new challenge, is to, learning to survive in the woods and learning to pack a mule and learning how to defend myself against various predators and stuff like that is one of my new challenges. And yeah.
How'd you stumble upon that?
So I started when I was right before I moved. So I moved from California to Montana last year. Right before I moved, I had been hanging out with some of my jiu-jitsu friends who were also hunting, and I went hunting with them and started kind of learning that stuff. And I realized like, oh, this is something that could scare me, like jiu-jitsu used to scare me, like going out into the woods alone and like figuring all these things out and learning how to survive. Like it seemed like the kind of challenge that would replace jiu-jitsu for me when I was no longer competing. So then once we moved to Montana, it's kind of just, everyone does that out here. So it's really accessible for me to find people to learn from and stuff.
And do you have any other, like looking forward, any other challenges or major milestones or goals within the kind of fields that you're already involved with? So with RP, with, really anything, do you have, books you want to write? I mean, just kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are or your
Yeah.
plans are heading forward.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the process of writing this book. I had co-authored a few other books at RP, and the co-authoring process was fun, but I really found the writing my own book to be a fun challenge, and it took some time. And it's funny because I was writing a book on habits, and then as I was reading and writing, I was learning better ways to develop a writing habit. So it helped me write the book. So that was really cool. But I liked that process a lot. I'd like to write a few more books on sort of the psychological aspect of nutrition pursuits. I haven't really outlined exactly what those are yet, but I'm definitely interested in writing a few more books.
Yeah. And again, I bring up another example that I use frequently. Daniel Kahneman, someone who studied kind of, I guess, like bias for most of his academic career. He has this quote where he talks about, he spent so much time studying the different bias that people can have when they're making decisions or thinking about something, and he still can't get away from it. He can't get out of the trap of exerting some sort of bias in his reasoning. Do you still struggle with building and forming and executing habits? Like, how was writing the book? Did you have any difficulty doing that?
It got better towards the end because I was actually using what I learned, but I definitely still struggle, and it's one of those things, like, now that I've read so much about it and I've read so much of the science and sort of conceptualized it in my mind, it's a lot easier. Like, I find that I usually pick a couple habits every couple months to sort of tack on to the ones I have to improve my life and make it more efficient. It's still a struggle, but it's definitely become less and less of a struggle. And I feel like I've become more organized and more efficient over time.
Do you have any examples of habits you're trying to form, or things that have done really well for you?
Yeah. So one of the first things I started doing when I was writing was I realized that I was sort of the most clear-headed in the morning. So instead of the other things I would usually do in the morning, I would get up, have a cup of coffee and breakfast, and just start writing. And I would just set several hours and write. Even if it was just trash that I had to edit heavily, I would write for a couple hours every morning. Recently, I've sort of tried to set a habit of starting my day with something productive. So I chose washing dishes. So I get up in the morning and I do the dishes, and I put the ones from yesterday away, and I make breakfast. And that's just sort of like how I set my day. And when I do that, it makes me feel sort of self-efficacious and, like I've got the day started off right, and it makes the rest of the day good. Once that was a solid habit, I was like, I want to end the day with something productive too. So we, out in Montana here, we have a big iron furnace thing in the living room. And since we're putting wood in it all the time, there's always wood crumbles sort of on the floor. So every night I vacuum those up with a hand vac, and then I organize our entryway. So we have 2 dogs and the 2 of us with our sort of snow stuff hanging there, boots and things. And it makes me feel much more calm when it's all lined up and organized. So I line that up and organize it, and I vacuum under the furnace. And those are my little habits that I've added. And I just sort of keep tacking little things on like that. And over time, I feel more and more organized and productive and sort of calm, because it doesn't feel like the house is getting out of control while I'm working on other things. So.
I'm not saying this is this is just kind of different from what we normally talk about on the podcast. So I'm not sure if people are really interested. I find this fascinating, and I find this really useful in that, I have a lot of pursuits, intellectual and physical, that I feel like could be improved based on the formation of better habits or more efficient habits. What does, and you kind of talked about the bookends of your day, right? Starting with something that is either productive and builds momentum, or something that is one of the bigger, more difficult tasks that you tackle when you're fresh.
Right.
And then you talk about having something at the end of the day to kind of cap it and to help, improve self-efficacy and kind of create a more effective space to work from. Mm-hmm. What would the most effective, or I guess most effective is probably the wrong way to frame it. What's a very effective day look like in terms of, say you have the book you just wrote, and you want to get the most out of your day that you can. What does that look like? And I guess the idea here is that anyone who has big goals, big tasks, they can help kind of align their day to suit the needs of whatever they want to achieve or accomplish.
Yeah, so for me, a good day looks like getting up on time, getting that first thing done that I do in the morning, dishes, breakfast, and then being efficient and productive throughout the day. I like to give myself a little sort of lunch break reward and watch a show and eat food for my midday meal, just to reward myself for being kind of productive before that. Then ideally just finishing everything that I had set out on my plate by the evening so that I can spend some time with James and the dogs and the cat, and or go see my mule. Just sort of having a day that is productive but balanced, and that I've given myself enough things to do that I feel good and have made progress, but I'm also not working morning till night, and I have some time to breathe and just sort of enjoy my life. We work so hard. There's taking that time to enjoy what we work for is always good.
Say we have a given block of time. Say you sit down to write and you say, I have, 3, 4, 5 hours where I can just kind of crank stuff out. The concept that I kind of think about is almost like mental fatigue, or kind of like a dulling of the, I guess, like the, like sense, not senses, but like intellect. So if you're working for like a long block of time, do you have a way that you structure that to make sure that you kind of maximize what you can get out of it and minimize, I guess, time where you're just kind of trudging along? Or is it more like a battle of attrition, where if you just work on something for long enough, you'll have a product and you can refine it later?
Yeah, I think that's probably an individual thing. For me, I tend to do better working for a long period without interruption, because I find it hard starting for me is the hard part. So starting and stopping is rough. My husband, on the other hand, he has a little bit of ADD, and that would kill him. So he'll do 20 minutes, take a break, 20 more minutes, take a break, and he's extremely productive like that. So for me, I just need to start and not stop. So usually when I get tempted to stop, like I said, I'll just sort of write trash, like just stream of consciousness, put some words down, and I'll go back later. And sometimes there's some good stuff in there that I can work with, sometimes not, but at least I maintain the habit of working during my assigned block. But yeah, I don't think that's not necessarily what would work best for everyone. So you kind of have to see how to structure your own habits for your best progress.
I think I can relate more with James on that one. I'll just work for like 15 minutes and then I'm just like, I need something else to do.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go make food, or just like, I don't know, do something else. I just need to get away from it. And when people, because I talk to people who maybe are writing a manuscript or something, and they're like, oh yeah, I just block off like 4 hours and just crank out work. And I'm like, I cannot imagine sitting still for that long, or even like thinking about doing that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I think it's nice to recognize the individuality of it. And
there's no shame in different styles or different structures. You
right.
never feel like you have to push yourself into somebody else's working style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I guess that's one of the, maybe, I don't know if it would be a misconception, but we kind of spoke on the diversity of incorporating and implementing and developing habits, that people kind of think it's like one way or the highway.
Right.
Is it really just trial and error, where you say, okay, let me try like an hour or 2 hours straight, and then let me try? Because I think if people have that similar style to James, where they work for 20 minutes and stop, that seems kind of like a failure to pay attention. Is it a matter of just reframing that? Or
I would say just reframe it. There's no wrong or right way if you're getting stuff done, right? So I think another important first step sort of in developing your behavior change plan is to take a good look at yourself. So spend some time trying to be mindful of how you respond to different situations, what situations you work best in, what sort of things get in your way, what sort of things really motivate you and help you to work better. And being mindful and self-monitoring for a while before you start to change can help you, because there will be a trial and error period where you try different tactics for behavior change, and some work better than others. But if you've taken the time to sort of know yourself well, you can probably start with a better informed plan and just tweak it a little, instead of just, trying everything one by one and seeing what sticks.
Yeah. No, and I think we, covered the topic well of habit. Well, I mean, we covered it well enough for a podcast that's, 55 minutes. But if people are interested in kind of, because you put up a lot of useful information, obviously you write for RP, you do a little bit of coaching. I mean, you're constantly putting out really valuable information on, similar topics. Where can people find that if they want to read more, know more? I mentioned where they can buy the book, but if they want to, again, to pick that up, or maybe to reach out and chat a little bit about it, get you on their podcast, where can they do that?
For sure. Finding me on Instagram is probably the easiest. I am regressive underload, and there's an underscore between those two words, little play on progressive overload. There I post a lot of stuff. My link tree there has links to like the book and lots of articles that I've written, and you can also send me a message. I respond to all of them as far as I know. Sometimes it takes me a minute, but I'm usually pretty good.
Yeah, I actually like regressive underload. That reminds me of Jordan Fagenbaum from Barbell Medicine. He talks about linear regression. You just do a 5x5 and reduce the weight every week until you're at the bar, which I think is really funny. But yeah, I really appreciate your time and for joining me on the podcast. And I think it, a lot of the concepts we talk about are really esoteric, like training and programming concepts, how you can maximize the dose response relationship or whatever it may be. But I think establishing the habits that allow you to actually carry out a behavior in the first place matters much more than the fine details that you can argue about for hours on a Zoom call. So I appreciate your time, and for everyone listening, go check out the book, the articles, her Instagram, and reach out if you feel necessary. You can leave a review for the podcast. I would appreciate it. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.